Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast mixing historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. Today we start a large project suggested on the Ars Magica forum. I'm going to go through a book called Sanctuary of Ice, which was my first book for the Ars Magica role-playing game. It was published 14 years ago, and I'm going to talk through its construction and suggest ways that it could be better used with the newer material which has come out since. This podcast will cover the first two chapters, the introduction and the Hermetic culture in the Greater Alps, which will leave me free to do a covenant per episode for the rest of this project. These first two chapters are mostly theoretical, so in this episode you'll primarily be getting my reminiscences as to why certain things were included in the book and other things were not, as opposed to future episodes which will include redesigns of the covenants under the modern rules. Before I launch into it, I'll note that I'm home today with a cold, and the reason I sound in this podcast as if I'm always on the edge of a sneeze is because I am. I'm actually sneezing for about half the recording length of this podcast, and I've gone through and chopped all of that out. So, pardon for any strange frog-like sounds. Ars Magica was a very different game 15 years ago. It was lower fantasy, and the historical research was, if not worse, then deliberately not as detailed. The level of research that I did then could be done in a weekend today, and could be far surpassed by anyone who had the free time and an internet connection. The game was also different because, or at least this was the argument I made at the time, and I realize some people will disagree or consider this controversial, the primarily American audience of the game was looking for something akin to a Western, where their characters go out into the wilderness and carve out a settlement for themselves. A point that I tried to make, and may have hammered home quite heavily in the first few chapters of Sanctuary of Ice, was that for your characters to be heading ever westward and seeking green pastures, there had to be somewhere back east, I believe I used to use the word metropole excessively, some area with more resources and more infrastructure from which your characters had sprung. When I first started writing Sanctuary of Ice, it was going to be a book about designing older covenants. That layer of it got peeled away, and the example covenants became the core of the book. Sanctuary of Ice is also a little bit different from the other earlier books in that it's difficult to pick a particular covenant and say, well, that's the villain. The earlier books generally all had a villain covenant, which I can understand the reason for. It makes stories very easy to design if going in you already have a foe developed. Basically, since the theme of many of the earlier books was that you want to go out into the woods and do your own thing, the villain was whoever was wanting to tell you what to do. So Blackthorn is evil, and House Guernicus is corrupt, and so forth. In Sanctuary of Ice, I wanted to get it to the point where people were trying to manipulate you, not because they had a will to power, but because they had goals that they wanted to achieve. I'm not certain that occurred in all cases, so I'm looking forward to going back through this process and finding ways to extrapolate and extend upon the material. The second edition book, Order of Hermes, said that there were 7 covenants in the Greater Alps. I wanted more, and so to get around that problem, rather than saying that Order of Hermes was wrong, I used the chapter house system. People have often said that I invented chapter houses. I don't believe I did. I believe I took them from an earlier work. Possibly the one set in Iceland, possibly the one where the Franciscans turn up hundreds of years early. Anyhow, chapter houses originally were a way of getting around that restriction. Thus we begin the tradition of design by accrual, which makes the game more and more difficult for new people to grasp. I used a very similar workaround in the Transylvania book, where, once again being told that I could only have 5 covenants, I made that an in-world obstacle which the Tremare had overcome by redefining what the word covenant meant, and having things which would be called covenants everywhere else called camps, or upida. I did this without realizing that I'd already done the same thing once before. I'd also briefly like to make the point that the terminology chapter house doesn't make any sense. A chapter house is a room in a monastery or attached to a cathedral where monks read a biblical chapter or a chapter of the rule that they follow each day. I don't understand why it would be attached to Hermetic covenants. I presume that it's a misattribution, that what's meant is a dependency or a daughter house. This comes up explicitly later when one of the covenants is referred to as the mother house, These are the appropriate monastic terms for when a monastery creates a second monastery at some distance. Additionally, 2 of the covenants aren't described in the book. This has always been how tribunal books work, but the problem is that it means that if you are wanting a complete setting where you do none of the research and none of the work, chunks are missing. I did originally write all of the covenants, and the spare ones turned up on my website. I'll be including those in later episodes. If you want a classic evil autumn covenant to bully your characters, the lack of 2 covenants gives you the space to add one. The next few pages deal with virtues that tie your characters to the Sanctuary of Ice setting, even if your covenant is set somewhere else, so close family ties, heir, patron. The idea being that your characters could visit this tribunal and participate in stories without having to go to the length of creating a covenant here. Early in the history of Ars Magica, this was not how things were done. Each of the different tribunals had a different theme, a different feel, and indeed, if you look at the 2nd edition book, Order of Hermes, you could say that each of the different tribunals is a different genre. I'd argue that if we were to do it again, we should go that way. In some of the later books, you get a sort of duplication where you go, okay, this is the tribunal, where's the large autumn covenant that's trying to run things? Where's the plucky up-and-coming covenant which is beset by fairies? In the same way that a tic-tac-toe board initially seems to present you with 9 options, but actually only gives you 3. When you're picking hermetic tribunals, there is some sensation, particularly in the older tribunal books, that the choices don't actually matter, that they are just iterations on a smaller number of choices with different stage dressing. Different genres would disrupt that repetitive pattern. And it would also solve questions like, when people ask which tribunal do I want to play in, genre markers would make that easier. You could say, well, Transylvania's horror, Normandy is comedy, Spain is a spaghetti western, whatever you thought was appropriate. I also like the idea of games where the genre markers are modifiers for the difficulty of spells. I had a really enjoyable game where all of the characters were members of the Royal Society in the 19th century, and they gained casting bonuses whenever they did anything that was quintessentially British, like when they needed to get across a ravine, rather than creating water, they created tea. Now, this was, of course, a comedy game, but I like the idea that you could claim that a spell is a magnitude easier because it's horror, or a spell is a magnitude easier because the outcome is funny. I think that gives the players an in-game benefit for keeping to tone. I used Roman symbols as status markers in Sanctuary of Ice because the order claimed descent from a group of Roman magicians. Also, the material was close to hand, and when you're writing for Ars Magica, you don't know how many shots you're going to get, so if you find good material, you may as well use it. You can make arguments that a person should be patient and wait for the appropriate book, but who knows if the appropriate book's going to come. In the current torpid state of Ars Magica play, should we have waited to do Ethiopia, or should we have put it in Lands of the Nile? If we had waited, you wouldn't be getting it, much in the same way you're not getting a book on Wangaria, which, to me at least, would be the next obvious geographical location to do, if we couldn't do Sicily. But moving on. Even the map in the introduction isn't excellent. And in this, I'm not criticising the people who drew the map. They drew the map based on overhead transparencies I scanned and then sent by email to my editor. In the modern day, the tools we have to construct maps are just so much better. For Transylvania, we traded Google Maps with pins in them. Not just for places, but for story hooks. Actually, that's a good idea. I should start a Google map as I'm doing these episodes to pin places to create a replacement for this map. Yes, let's do that. In drawing the border, you can see that I've grabbed the bits that I think are most interesting. Why, for example, is Vienna in the Greater Alps? There's nothing, when you're initially looking at the map, that's out that way. I mean, sure, it's on the Danube, but it turns out that the Transylvanian tribunal only barely stretches out that far. Couldn't it instead have been in the Rhineland? The answer is, of course, but I had good material about the bridge that's near Vienna, and so I wanted to use it, and so the border, insofar as was possible, had to be stretched out slightly to give me the little spaces that I wanted. You'll also note that the Tower of Ashes and the Sanctuary of Ice are rather far to the west. They could have been put anywhere else, and the reason they're there is because the border was in some sense already drawn for me, There is a map that we were going off, and I needed to put them there to justify the border being where it was. That it has the positive effect, from my perspective, of giving me Geneva is neither here nor there. It does, however, place them very close to the Domus Magnus of various other houses, which are just across the border. In terms of travel distance, for example, it would make a lot more sense from the Magi of those two areas to go to their adjoining tribunals rather than going to, say, Valnastium, when they wanted to purchase things. Having worked through the first chapter, now let's look at the second chapter. Basically, I took an ice pick to the idea of Covenants living in manorial seclusion. And I did this again in Covenants because it's the lazy design choice. It's the obvious design choice. It's the medieval feeling design choice in the sense that everyone wants a castle on the hill where people leave them alone. But because it's obvious, books that you pay for shouldn't necessarily cater to that choice. You can do that without any help from me or anyone else. The books have to push extremes because otherwise, having read them, you don't feel like you've seen anything new, and so you feel as though the book was stale. Also, very early Ars Magica didn't understand how feudalism actually worked. It tended to see the way the Normans behaved in England as the model of feudalism which everyone else followed, and that was never the case. They were a fringe, exceptional case in most areas. People were interdependent, and pyramidal power structures really didn't happen. And the more we know about British history, the more obvious it is that it didn't happen in British history either. That although the pyramidal structure was an ideal, it was an ideal that people who were fighting to be on the tip of the pyramid respected only in the sense that it gave them a role to aspire to. In Alpine Hermetic law, I said that everyone needed to have enough Vivs to maintain themselves, to maintain their voting rights. This is a direct counter to some of the material which had been in the previous edition of Ars Magica, which said that magic was fading out because magi were overusing the resources which are available to them. I thought that if magicians had noticed this trend, that magic was dying out because there were too many magi, they would do something about it, and the people who would do something about it are the people who had the most to lose. Therefore, in places of power, like the Alps, they would say, you younglings aren't allowed to destroy the world. All the power stays with us and our heirs. So Viz sources and voting rights, at least initially, make your characters seem like they're independently wealthy, but really you're not getting anything that you don't already have through the Covenant design process. In the new edition, none of this is necessary because, if anything, magic is becoming more common. Magical auras appear around places where great magic is done and where magical creatures live. Your characters are doing great magic, and therefore magic is, arguably at least, increasing. Magic fading out is necessary if you want to do something like Tolkien, where you say, oh, that world becomes our world, or like Mage, where you say, oh, eventually the world you're playing in becomes the world you're living in now, you just haven't noticed. That's not terribly interesting, and strong stances against it were taken in later books. For example, this is why fairies now regenerate even if you destroy them. It's so that you don't clearfill all the resources in your vicinity and make the land mundane. This means that the Alpine Public Viz law doesn't really have a strong moral underpinning in the same way it did when we were talking about population control for conservation purposes. Also, this is the first time a tribunal has a taxing power. That is, the Quaesitors and Mercures are allowed to take a pawn of Viz per magus per year. If Hermetic warfare is rarer, then once again feudal territorial structures break down. The feudal territorial structures in Norman England, at least theoretically, are there is a castle, and around the castle are people who can take shelter in the castle, and when they're not doing that, they tend the land for the lord to maintain his capacity to defend them. Of course, that's romanticised. That's not really how medieval peasants felt about the whole thing, but that's the theory. If you're not going to be having regular wars, however, power diffuses over the resources available, and because it's not encoded in architecture, it becomes rather more like power in Southeast Asia, that is, a series of concentric circles of influence, which people who are into these things call mandalas. If you have a series of concentric circles of influence, and you have some belief that military aggression is unlikely, there's no reason to gather all of your magi together when you can instead spread them out into those places where their research is most assisted by the environment, and this is where the chapter houses come from. The concept of murdering your own children when they do the wrong thing and ostracism were placed in this book again so that characters who were somewhere else, and when I say somewhere else, let's just be clear, I mean England. Everyone was playing in the British Isles at this stage of the game because British materials were the easiest to get. Now that the internet has made material about travel a lot more common and easy to access, people think about setting games elsewhere, but when Sanctuary of Ice came out, most people were playing in British settings. So if your characters are going to be playing in Britain, how can you be enticed to travel to the Alps? Or how can characters who have been raised and trained in the Alpine system be sent out into Britain? This is a major focus of the first two chapters. In a more modern Tribunal book, rather than merely giving the mechanism of ostracism, there would be a series of plot hooks directly underneath, 3 ways to use each of these ideas. At least one way to use the idea, but preferably 3. So, for example, you'd have your characters discovering a diary from a beloved mentor that indicates that they were ostracized from the Alps for a crime that the characters can then investigate and somehow ameliorate. Or an ostracized character moves into your character's tribunal and is spending his time there plotting revenge and asks for your assistance or is grabbing resources of yours which you need to protect. Or a character's mentor has been ostracized and must move all of his valuables outside of the Alps, and they ask for the character's assistance to transport their valuable mystical cargo. The modern writing style is that pretty much everything should tie directly into plot hooks, rather than merely imply plot hooks. If everything is permanently in the state of being about to boil over, if you're worried that war could break out at any moment, it doesn't make any sense to split the party and send people off travelling. However, in history we have examples of people who do just this. Good King Macbeth from Scotland goes to Rome. He manages to leave his kingdom for 2 years, and it doesn't cause any problems so far as we can tell. Now, the kings from further south never do this, because the kings there are permanently in a state of war either with their neighbours in France or with each other, and so they can't afford to take 2 years away from their realm. But if you assume the Alps is relatively peaceful, it means travel is possible. It means running games outside your home tribunal is possible, particularly if you use travel magic, which was less common in the earlier Ars Magica books and became more and more common as authors, looking at what their own characters could do, tried to find ways of bypassing all of the wandering monster random rubbish that you found in other role-playing games. Hoplites already existed in Ars Magica, but Sanctuary of Ice is the first game, I think, where the idea that they have permanent stations and magic items that are reserved for their use and particular uniforms were defined. That is, they became a military force. Before that, Quaesitors were sort of like sheriffs who would ride into town but then be basically useless when they got there because they mostly had Intelligo spells, which are pointless in apprehending people, so they'd turn up with a powerful temporary hoplite in tow. Hoplites are also given free longevity potions in Sanctuary of Ice because in the earlier books you needed to be a great corpus magician to create longevity potions, even of medium strength, and so most characters eventually distorted their studies into corpus. If you spent a lot of time going around assisting the Order, your character would age rapidly compared to more self-interested peers. I added Amaranth, which is an addictive hermetic drug, because I wanted characters to have the possibility of committing crimes that weren't life or death situations. The Code of Hermes is so sparse that it limits the crimes you can commit to things which are punished basically by death. By adding Amaranth trading, I was hoping to add an extra layer to stories that are based around hermetic lore. The next section about population control and emigration again allows me to tie the material in this book to sagas which are set in the British Isles. It says that they export their children, and this was, at this early stage of the game's development, one of the few obvious ways of the characters doing the equivalent of D&D parties meeting in a tavern. How do these people who have such different needs and skills get together in the first place? One of the answers from Sanctuary of Ice is their parents just put them together and tell them where to go. Notice that House Tremare is still the villains this early on. One of the great reasons that all the Alpine tribunals work together is because the terrible Tremere are just to the east. Redcaps are then explored as mythic companions. I think this is the first time this happened in the line. that redcaps weren't either mortals pretending to be magi or magi who just didn't happen to have any powers. That the redcaps would have magic items that they lent out to members of the house isn't made explicit in any of the previous books in the line. The magic items that they borrow in Sanctuary of Ice are called Whitlams. Some Australians thought that this was a reference to Gough Whitlam, who was a Prime Minister of Australia who was on our political left and therefore who believed in borrowing heavily to invest in public infrastructure. Actually, no. While I was writing this book, I was listening to a CD on repeat. It was Love This City by the Whitlams. This is followed by the section on Hermetic festivals, or the Hermetic year. I kind of forgot that I'd done this, and so it turns up again in the book about nobles. The first thing I noticed, and this could be because I'm Australian and so our weather is backward here, is that in the standard rules, the Aegis of the Hearth is recast every midwinter. I can't see a reason for that, other than that the Magi liked freezing in the dark, and so it was moved to midsummer in Sanctuary of Ice, and that meant that several other festivals had to be rearranged to fit the new timetable. The festivals are Roman festivals, but they're ones that are chosen specifically to get your characters involved with things that are happening in the Alpine Tribunal. So Liberalia, where a ceremony of welcome is held each March, is an opportunity for you to get your characters together. Also, it corrects an issue that was embedded in Order of Hermes, where it suggested apprentices were only released at tribunal meetings, presumably on the assumption when that was said that the tribunal meetings revolved around Europe rather than all being pretty much in an identical year. By adding a ceremony of welcome every year, it meant that your characters didn't reach the end of their apprenticeship up to 6 years older than other characters in the same group. It also meant that if you lived in one of the tribunals that released its apprentices every 7 years, your one way of being released was to come to the Alps and meet all the other apprentices being released in the same year, which again served as a stepping-off point for new sagas. Also, that allows me to go into Tarragon Vale, which was the suggested point where you could just plop a covenant if you didn't want to do any of the design work. The Midsummer Fair now seems like an obvious idea, but it wasn't one that appeared in the earlier books. In the earlier books, if your characters wanted to buy something, you would say to the local redcaps, hey, I want this thing, and then they would go and find that thing and bring it back, and you'd pay whatever they asked for it. The idea that magicians might get together to sell stuff first appears here. It uses the reverse auction system, because I like the idea of them, and because they're quicker in play. The idea of Boot Burning Day and Baker's Day was to emphasise the fact that magicians did something other than find ways of gaining experience points. This is an idea which comes out far more strongly in Houses of Hermes societies. The point I was trying to emphasise is that your characters don't know that they're in a game. And so the idea that Magi would never get married because that would stop them from earning experience points, or Magi would never take time out of their labs to see their families because that would stop them earning experience points, makes sense from one perspective of play, where the purpose of the character is to amass as many points as possible. It doesn't make any sense from another style of play, where the purpose of the character is to develop during a story, thereby providing plot. Similarly, I got some responses concerning the idea of the games that Magi would not care, that they would be absolutely uninterested in the activities of their companions, and so they wouldn't field teams, and that I had brought this in because I was an Australian and it met one of our cultural values. That last point aside, because I can't refute it, I can't step outside my own experience enough to discount it, is to say that your character doesn't know that he's an experience gathering machine, and therefore the idea that getting together with friends and watching sport is a foolish thing that no sensible person would ever do is one that I thought was bizarre and alien. Now that we have more modern styles of discourse on games design and we have models of theory, I can see that for many of you that objection makes perfect sense. However, for me, the idea is to tell stories, and if you're telling the same story each time where your character just wants to amass the largest pile of experience points possible, I can't see why you'd play the game more than once. And so this is a distinct shove of the game in the other direction.